but it seemed that she had been in this for 27 years. Hi, welcome to another episode of Criminality Patrol. Today's story is unusual and surprising. It's straight out of a series that's hard to believe. We also spent a few days wondering whether to even talk about this story, how to talk about it, whether to make a report about it. I said it's unbelievable because it seemed to me that today, in this day and age, something like this is simply impossible. At first I thought it was some kind of fake news, something unrealistic. Something exaggerated by journalists or by some kind of situation. Well, we did check certain things, and here it turned out that this story is actually true. Probably some of you have guessed that this is about the story from Świętochłowice. Well, a 15-year-old girl, Mirella, I would say. It seems from the perspective of the times we live in. So we live in an era of all kinds of documents and people who are around us, families, personal identification numbers, identification cards, passports. Well, it's just impossible for it to be real. And yet a 15-year-old girl disappears at some point. Well, whether she disappears, I would say for the world she does, and she reappears exactly 27 years later. And although we know a lot about this case today, I would say that even though we know a lot, basically we know very little. Świętochłowice, well, a fairly large town, about 46,000 people. Also, it's the kind of community where if people live somewhere, they usually know each other, take an interest in each other and talk. Well, in some way, they create their own inner world. Mirella lives there. In 1997, Mirella is 14 years old. She goes to elementary school, and that's elementary school number 8, right here in Świętochłowice. At that time, in 1997, she was in class 8B. Like any 14-year-old girl, she was full of life, probably full of dreams too. On top of that, as everyone who saw her back then says, she was an exceptionally beautiful girl. They say about her that she was one of the prettiest girls in the school, one of the most beautiful girls. A girl from the neighborhood, and at the same time ambitious and smart. If we look at her grades, well, she was really doing pretty well in school. She was especially into the humanities, with an artistic flair, because above all, she got good and very good grades in those subjects. On the other hand, she struggled more with the sciences, but I would say it was still within the normal range. She saw nothing unusual there. It wasn't like she couldn't handle something like math or physics. A bit worse grades, but that's normal. Also a few different kinds of absences from school, but again, everything was within the normal range. All those absences were excused. Full of life, she goes on trips with her class. They go to the Czech Republic. They go to Wisła. Well-dressed, as her classmates from those years say. She had new, neatly covered books and notebooks. She also had breakfast prepared by her parents, probably by her mother. It might seem funny to her, but one of her friends even says that she had those sandwiches with some better pâté. Today, as I said, it's funny, but back then it mattered. Also, those new books mattered too, because not everyone had a new book. So everything indicated that she was committed to learning. On top of that, she goes to the swimming pool, she goes to the club, she has no problems with moving around. A normal 14-year-old girl who is just starting her life. I think she had such a set of skills that could have made her achieve something that we simply call success. She actually finishes elementary school number 8. She has dreams. It seems that those dreams were set high. I would say the bar was set high, because she goes to Jan Kochanowski High School in Świętochłowice. And that's one of the best high schools in this city. That's how it is now, and that's how it was back then. I think it was actually in first place. So you can see from this that he has ambitious plans. He starts studying at this high school. Well, nothing's happening. He starts studying just like it's the beginning of the class, the beginning of a new school, a change of environment. He doesn't study long during the day. That's because until January 6th exactly, it was the year 1998, and on January 6th, her parents remove her from the list of students at that school. That's the epiphany. Does that matter in this case? Not necessarily, because the case is so astonishing that anything could matter. Nevertheless, on January 6, 1998, Mirella is removed from the list of students, and her parents take her out of school. And basically the trail goes cold. No one at the school knows why Mirella stopped attending. It definitely wasn't related to any illness. It definitely wasn't because she was struggling. She never mentioned anything like that to her classmates, either boys or girls. An astonishing story. Basically, every parent has the right to do that, to take their child out of school. At that time, compulsory schooling lasted until the completion of elementary school. So theoretically, that has changed now. This compulsory schooling, or I would say care from the state, what happens with such a student is until the age of 18. Back then, it was until finishing primary school. So it's like the state isn't interested in what happens next with Mirella, because there simply aren't such basics. I think the only one who took an interest in what happens with Mirella, it was the school counselor. She even asked one of her friends who used to go to elementary school with her. And later they met again in high school. I mean, they went to the same high school but were in different classes. She just wanted her to go to her house and check what happened. So why did Mirella quit that good high school? The friend actually goes, knocks on the door, but no one opens the door for her. Then, as she said herself, she walked by several more times. But she didn't see Mirella anywhere. She didn't see her in the window. She didn't see her in front of the building. She was only 15 years old too. She had her own responsibilities. Then she stopped coming. She thought that probably something had happened. The neighbors were the same. Well, they knew that Mirella was there. It's a small 2-room apartment on the 2nd floor. Some of those neighbors had lived there before, because that family, they used to live somewhere else before. Then they moved into this building. Some of them already knew each other from the previous place, but they knew that Mirella was there. They asked Mirella's mother, the parents, what happened to their daughter. And Mirella's mother, Mrs. Lydia, says that they should take better care of their own children. So various hypotheses appeared. Well, one hypothesis was this, that Mirella was supposed to return to her biological parents. Another hypothesis was that she disappeared. Some people also thought that because she knew that Mirella's mother's brother, her uncle, was in Germany. He lives there permanently. He started a family there, so they suspected that maybe she went to Germany and she lived with her uncle there, and she goes to school there. That was likely because it was 1999. A lot of people were leaving, and in Germany they were looking for a new life somewhere, yeah? There was no other information about Mirella. No one had seen her, of course. This took a while, and people kept asking what happened to her. And there were all kinds of hypotheses here, but in fact, no one knew what was happening to her. First weeks went by, then months, then years. Basically, a new generation came in. Well, naturally, after some time. Everyone got used to it, that Mirella just wasn't there, that those people, that couple, that married couple who were Mirella's parents, well, they just lived alone. They also eventually retired. Mirella's father worked in Katowice. He was some kind of mechanic, somewhere there at the bus depot. As for her mother, Mirella's mother worked at a roasting plant, coffee in Chorzów. They retired. When Mirella disappeared, they were about 55 years old. Today they are 82. So their age is quite advanced now. But back then, they were just people, middle-aged people. And basically, it seemed that the fact that Mirella disappeared, well, in some way, Some people explained it to themselves or had their own theory about it. But, well, I don't think anyone expected this. What happened on July 29th this year? So it was July 29th. But this is already, I think, one of those arguments, one of those loud arguments in Mirella's parents' apartment. Like I said, they're already 82 years old. You could hear some loud bangs there, like something being knocked over or furniture being moved. Shouting? Well, the neighbors had enough of it because it kept happening. What was the argument about? It's not exactly known. Anyway, the neighbors decided to do it, to call the police. The officers arrived, and after a moment, an ambulance also arrived, and people who saw it, they knew the family. When they saw who was coming out of the apartment, they were in shock. Exactly 27 years later, she was found. Mirella, well, that's unbelievable, but it seemed like she, for 27 years, was in that apartment. That for 27 years she was doing something there in that apartment and nobody knew about it. Well, it was assumed that she simply wasn't there. It's unbelievable. For nearly 30 years not to suspect, know, or even guess that someone could be behind the wall. Well, I would say that's just unbelievable. But that's actually how it was. The neighbors saw it. Mirella's father wasn't home. He had gone out. Only her mother was there. But they saw it, that Mirella was coming out of the apartment. But it wasn't the same Mirella anymore. That pretty 15-year-old girl, it was some old woman. To put it bluntly, wrinkled. Basically, that face, well, it's the face of an old lady. Part of the hair, or part of the head. She didn't have any hair, it was half a head, she was actually bald. The other part of the head, there was some long hair, but it was like twisted dreadlocks. And she could barely walk, she could hardly move her legs. You could see that she had trouble walking. Her legs were completely black. Somehow the rescuers were helping her to go down. She got into the ambulance. She was basically put in and taken to the hospital. It was quite a scene, truly tragic. The image of someone who was held, someone who was hidden, someone who was under certain dramatic conditions, well, some, I would say, in conditions that are different. I would say it was I would say, and it was, and that's what it was. I would say, there was this and there was something else. I would say, beds, a bucket, well, probably the bucket was there so she could take care of her needs. Physiological needs meant everything likely smelled bad. She was taken to the hospital and it turned out that her legs were in a terrible condition, especially her legs. I won't even mention how she looked because that was also tragic, but it was her legs that were in the worst state. It was dramatic, holes through which you could see the bones. It turned out she simply had sepsis. The fact that those spouses and parents argued somehow saved her life because even the doctors could see that if it had continued, this woman would have simply died, so her life was saved at the last moment. Mirella stayed in this hospital for 2 months. For 2 months, they tried somehow to bring her back to life, to somehow heal those wounds. She already started saying back then that she was in that apartment, that no one was holding her there, that basically it was of her own free will. Both her mother and father visited her in that hospital. Old friends from her childhood also came to visit. They even organized a fundraiser, and as far as we know, the online collection is still ongoing because this is money that will be needed for her rehabilitation, money to do something about her hair, money to cover the gaps in her teeth, so that this woman today can somehow be restored to the appearance of someone who is only 42 years old. So the fundraiser is still ongoing. After 2 months, Mirella returned home. She went back to her parents, and she is still there. It's a bit, I would also say, that's why we're making this material, because it's a bit of a surprising situation, since she's still dependent on those two parents of hers. Those friends even went there. They brought her some clothes, some things like cosmetics or other necessary items to her house. The mother said her mother doesn't need those things, as she and her husband have a pension and they should just take everything away. Right now she's in that house and there really is care from social services. Workers come and take care of her. The community officer also comes, but Mirella is still there. When she talked with her friends, well, I would say that she had all those memories, those childhood scents in her mind. At the time, condensed milk in a tube was popular, and she remembered it. She also remembered that she wanted to go to the zoo because she liked the zoo, and she wanted to go to Wiswa. So, as you can see from all this, she remembers what happened 27 years ago. She speaks quite sensibly, she speaks rationally, and somehow she still has dreams. As I said, she hasn't learned anything that would be in any way modern, because even her friends wanted to leave her a phone. And she says, but what am I supposed to do with this phone? Well, it seems that a mobile phone is just something she simply doesn't get. It's hard to blame her, since 27 years is a technological gap, and in '99, mobile phones were just starting to appear. Honestly, regular people just didn't have them. That same evening, when Mirella was taken by the ambulance, her parents were cleaning up her room. Even the neighbors said exactly that. No, they were cleaning up all that mess. So they were taking out everything that was in her room. So those dirty comforters, which were all covered in feces, leftovers of some food, old newspapers. They took all of that to the dumpster and just threw it away there. There were such conversations with my mother. Mother said that the fact that the girl didn't leave the house, the apartment, was Mirella's decision. She simply didn't want to go out. Mirella herself also admits that it was indeed her decision. No one forced her to do it. She could have left. But it looks like for some reason she stayed in that apartment at the age of 15. Presumably she was still going out, because one of the neighbors says that about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, she was walking early in the morning, coming back home from a night shift around 6:30, and she saw Mirella sitting in a park or a small grove near that apartment block. He looked sad. She was probably crying too, but she got up and walked toward the apartment block. So maybe those were some breakthrough moments back then as well. For those 27 years, Mirella appears to have been in that room. She didn't have an identification card issued. Well, you usually get your identification card when you turn 18. Of course, you can get it earlier, but it's usually at 18, so her parents never got her that identification card. Well, then, in 2001, she would have been 18. That's when you usually get the document. Did her parents already assume back then that she would never need that identification? It's kind of a requirement to have an identification card in Poland, but of course no one really checks whether someone has gotten their identification card. Also, if someone lives outside the country, they don't have to have an identification card. A lot of people travel or live in different countries and simply don't have a Polish identification card. So she never had that identification card made. She was never at the doctors, never at the nurses, never at the hairdressers, never at the beauticians. She didn't have friends, girlfriends. She didn't have what all of us go through at that age: breakdowns, love, dilemmas. None of that was in her life. The neighbors, too, I would say, are shocked because they never saw anyone else in the window or on the balcony except her parents. So I think, well, the shock on their part must be huge when they suddenly realize that right behind the wall in the same building for 27 years, someone lived here whom they had no idea even existed. Well, although these are all facts, as I said, that she was in that room for 27 years, what can you do in a room for 27 years where there wasn't even a television? Well, that's a completely different thing, but I suppose maybe it's possible to answer that. Over the years, she also didn't learn such basic things, I would say, like even how to use cutlery. She only learned that in the hospital. Those first meals were such that she was a bit like a person who never learned this anywhere. Like someone raised, I don't know, in some jungle. She would break everything up with her hands, crumble it, and only then put it in her mouth. Also, I think, well, with on one hand, there are those problems with moving with her legs, and on the other hand, she also had trouble going down the stairs because she simply couldn't go down those stairs. Walk. These are preliminary hearings now. This investigation started recently on October 14th. This is tending toward abuse, but in this case, the parents or older people aren't facing charges. There is still this aspect, on one hand, that the mother talks about, that it was her voluntary decision. Mirella, as if all of this confirms it, but when she disappeared, she was 15 years old. She was just a child. There are, of course, different kinds of phobias. There are illnesses. Agoraphobia, of course, that's also a terrible phobia or illness. As I read, it affects almost 1.5% of the human population. Well, that's millions of people. In fact, it's true that every time they go out, every meeting with people, it's a real ordeal for them. Yeah, panic, going outside, meeting people, facing criticism. Well, each of us probably experiences criticism in some way, but these people aren't able to function normally. However, in Mirella's case, nothing like that was visible. No, there were no symptoms that she might be suffering from something like that. Because after all, she went on trips with her class, she went to the swimming pool, she had friends, she had a best friend who visited her at home. So, well, that's really not the case here. Even if there was something like that, that she was paralyzed, couldn't go out, that's what parents are for. Well, then 55-year-old people who try to help such a child in some way, take them to a psychologist. They talk, they try to treat well and not leave them in an apartment, in a room for 27 years. And it seems that at some point, maybe it was also because of their age, but they basically gave up on her because the state she was in that room, well, it was, as they say, a picture of misery and despair, filth, stench, and poverty. However, the rest of the house was well kept and clean, so in a way they just left her to herself. What did she eat? How did she live? What happened when she was in pain? Because even, as she said, every window was closed for us because every draft of air caused it. Air would get into the wounds, causing unbearable pain to bear. So those are also questions. Today, nobody, any accusations? The parents don't. She is still their parent. I also think that this is difficult to solve because after all, she hasn't known other people for almost the last 30 years. She only knows her parents. For me, it's also a bit like the Stockholm Syndrome, the victim and the one who is somehow responsible for this situation. I hesitate to use executioner since it's too strong. Someone who is responsible for this situation, maybe she took it all upon herself. Those childhood friends also always say that the mother dominated in that house, that she was the one who decided. Besides, when they came now, she also wouldn't let Mirella finish her sentences. She would finish her sentences for her. You can see she's a woman who kept everything firmly under control. The household, and she always had the final say. Did she silence her daughter like that? Did she make her feel a sense of injustice? Did she make her feel any kind of inferiority complexes? I don't know. Maybe there was something to it, because one of her friends also says that Mirella was somehow pedantic, that before she left the house, well, she really had to have her hair done. There couldn't be a single strand of hair sticking out. Everything had to be perfect, and even just the way she got out of the pool or left the house, well, it all took her longer than other kids. But at the age of 15, a pimple on your nose can really be a huge problem, let alone participate. So, well, I don't see any logic here either. Anything that could even be a symptom of a disease. The situation is surprising. As I said, I don't think we've had a case like this in Poland, and there are very few worldwide. Maybe someone somewhere has heard that someone was found in the jungle or raised by monkeys, but this story is happening among people in an apartment building where a 15-year-old girl for 27 years, she wasn't missing. She was just hidden in a room in the apartment building. Unbelievable. We'll keep watching this case. We'll see what else it will bring. Mirella is supposed to be questioned soon in the presence of a psychologist, but I think that, well, maybe she has a chance for it because, after all, she speaks logically, thinks, behaves, has her own dreams. So maybe there is a chance that the next part of her life she could spend and see something that, as a young girl, as a young woman, she didn't have a chance to see. Well, let's hope that's how it will be. But from a psychological point of view, it's definitely an extremely difficult situation. Also, her parents are 82. Even if they were charged, would that change anything here? Probably not much. And that's all for today's commentary on this case. Well, of course, subscribe to us, and as always, take care.